the intersection of ancient Kemet, Kush, and the Maafa, the African Holocaust, or transatlantic slave trade, holds profound significance in understanding contemporary geopolitics and the African diaspora's identity. Recognizing ancient Kemet, Kush, as the cradle of African civilizations underscores the cultural heritage and ancestral ties that diasporic Africans rightfully embrace. While many scholars traditionally mark the beginning of the Maafa in the medieval period, Dr. Kwame Nantambu extends its origins to Narmer's unification of ancient Kemet, highlighting its resistance to Eurasian invasions. Despite awareness of enslavement in East Africa by various empires like the Romans, Greeks, and Arabs, scant attention is given to the East African involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Notably, the enslavement and trafficking of remnant black populations from ancient Kemet and Kush during the collapse of their dynasties. This historical connection sheds light on the enduring impact of colonization, exploitation, and displacement on African peoples across continents, shaping their experiences of oppression and resilience. According to Dr. Musa Lam's documentation in the African Union Factbook, following the Persian invasion of Northeast Africa, many ancient Kemites migrated west and Central Africa. These migrations were driven by factors such as oppression from foreign invaders and a desire to escape their rule. These ancient Kemites' descendants would later become victims of the Maafa, the transatlantic slave trade, and be trafficked to the Americas. Historical records indicate that with each invasion of ancient Kemet by foreigners, a significant portion of its indigenous black population sought refuge by emigrating to other regions of Africa, particularly south or west of Kemet. This pattern of migration occurred repeatedly, with scholars identifying as many as 6 major migrations westward across the Sahara Desert alone. Professor Aboubakar Moussa Lom, from the Faculty of History and Human Sciences at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, has shed light on these migrations. He has highlighted the work of Yoro Diao, a historian from the late 19th century, who compiled Western Sudanic oral traditions regarding migrations from the Nile Valley. These traditions, spanning from the 7th century BC to the 6th century AD, corroborate the existence of 6 major migrations from the Nile Valley toward the west, across the Sahara Desert. Each of these migrations, as described by Diao, was prompted by external invasions of the Nile Valley or by the oppressive regimes established by foreign rulers. These movements of people not only shaped the demographic landscape of Western Africa, but also underscored the Nile Valley's profound influence on the cultures and societies of the Western Sudan. The first migration might have been a result of the Assyrian invasion of ancient Kemet and the defeat of the Kushite kings of the 25th dynasty in 660 BC. The traditions of the Soninke, Sarakole, founders of the Ghana Empire, 250-1070 AD, from whose ashes rose the Mali and Songhai empires at different times, assert that their remote founding ancestor was born in the region of Sona or Aswan in Upper Kemet. He brought with him 2 zoomorphic divinities, the serpent and the vulture, the ancient Kemetian symbols of royal dominion over Upper and Lower Kemet. The water-dwelling serpent, Bida, became the national deity of Ouagadougou, capital of the Ghana Empire. Moreover, these traditions speak of a jackal that guided the early migrations and therefore answers to the Kemetian opener of the way, the divine jackal Westward, or Anubis. Boubacar Lam situates the departure of the Soninke ancestors from Kemet no later than 486 BC as a result of the exactions of the Persian king Darius, who reigned between 522–486 BC on the inhabitants of the Nile Valley, the foundations of the society and state that would later become the Empire of Ghana would have occurred no later than 460 BC. The Songhai Empire the last of the three early great empires in West Africa, was said to be originally established by Kushite immigrants. They may represent a branch of the Kushites from Kemet that chose to move west after 660 BC. There are two tarikhs, Western Sudanic historical manuscripts that survive from the 7th century. One of them describes the migration of the magicians who contended against Moses, c. the 1230 BC, westwards into the country of the later Songhai found the city of Kukia. This would suggest Songhai Nile Valley origins dating earlier, even than the 25th Kushite dynasty, 750-660 BC. The Lebu of Senegal's Atlantic coast in and around Dakar assert that their original homeland was Libya. The word Lebu was the ancient Kemetian name for the land and people west of the Nile, i.e. Libya, and was also a word meaning lion. The Lebu have an interesting ritual called the lion game, in which actors dress and act like lions. There is also a clan of fisher folk among the Pular-speaking people of Guinea who are called Diba. The clan totem is a hippopotamus. In ancient Kemet, one of the words for hippopotamus was dib. Moreover, the Diba use exactly the same kind of harpoon used by ancient Kemetian fishermen and hippo hunters. In the Kemetian language, Pereye became the term pharaoh. In Wolof and Pearl, the word Fari is a title of the king. The first pharaoh of a united Kemet was known as Mena. The first king of both the Tukoleo and the Soninke was Mana. A slight corruption of Nano, the title the Akan people of modern-day Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire give to their kings. The Akans are said to be blood relatives of the Soninke, Sarakole of the old Ghana Empire, who are now spread over modern Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Mauritania, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, and Guinea-Bissau. According to Boubacar Lam, the earliest kingdoms of the Western Sudan from about 460 BC were neo-pharaonic kingdoms and would remain so until the beginnings of Islamization of the region with the Almoravid conquest, 1076 AD. Another important stream of the emigration form, ancient Kemet, came down southwards through the Congo forest. From the Congo forest, some went westwards to occupy the near west coast of Africa. Others more migrated from the Congo forest, precisely around the general area of present-day Cameroon and the Gabon, to occupy East Africa and what is today the SADC countries. This was the branch from ancient Kemet that European historians call the Bantus, of the now famous Bantu migration, which took place between 1000 BC to 1500 AD. But originally, they were from the stock of ancient Kemet and Nubia who migrated to avoid the foreign invaders who attacked their homelands in the Nile Valley. Enslaved Africans from the Happy River Valley were also trafficked along intercontinental trade routes to Western and Central Africa before being sold to colonial plantations in the Americas. From the end of the 17th century, Africans arrived in France in significant numbers, and during the 18th, royal policy permitted French slave owners in the Americas to bring their slaves to France. Tous became a more common site in France. Mukhless has been published about the African presence in other parts of Europe. However, a number of Africans, especially Ethiopian envoys and pilgrims, visited Europe during the late Middle Ages. And by the 15th century, Ethiopian monks and other Africans, including some slaves, were living in Venice, the Vatican, and neighboring cities. Venetians were slave traders and slave owners too. Although most slaves seem to have been of European and Asian origin, some were Africans. Indeed, the trade in African slaves increased after the fall of Constantinople had restricted the Black Sea traffic. Most seem to have been obtained from Kemetian ports, a point which suggests that their origin included the Nile Valley of the Sudan. Documentation is too scanty to generalize about the Africans' lives in Venice and neighboring areas. Some reports assert that they became absorbed into local families, thereby accounting for their virtual disappearance by the late 18th century. Also relevant to their status is the fact that unfree persons were excluded from certain crafts. So African slaves and servants probably suffered this disadvantage. Some observers, however, have noted that slaves were granted the protection of the law. All slaves had to be baptized, and this may have encouraged more lenient conditions. However, slaves were unfree and unequal, and the physical and psychological limitations suffered require more study before final conclusions are reached. Dutch expansion in West Africa developed more or less spontaneously. In 1617, the Dutch were so strong in Senegambia that they were a dominant force in the island of Gorée and had largely eliminated not only the Portuguese but also the English and the French from trade in Joal, Portugal and Rufisque. They held their strong position for over 50 years. At the same time, their ships visited Loango, the Congo, and Angola. Initially, like the English and the French, they were little interested in the slave trade. The turn of the 16th century, however, heralded a new phase of European expansion in Africa in which the slave trade grew in significance to become of the utmost importance to the Dutch as well. This phase began with the purchase of slaves in Elmina, Accra, Arda, Benin, and the Nile Delta, and also Calabar, Gabon, and Cameroon. The slaves were sold in return for sugar to the plantations on Saint Thomas Island, then occupied by the Dutch, or were transported to Brazil. In the Eastern slave trade, enslaved Africans were taken from the east coast of Africa, the modern countries of Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and the island of Madagascar. They also came from the Savannah area, which includes countries such as Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan, and the Horn of Africa, which covers Djibouti, Somalia, and Ethiopia. Enslaved Africans from Sudan and southern Egypt were transported to Zanzibar before being smuggled into the Americas. In the mid-19th century, Zanzibar was a hub for illegal slave trade, dominated by slavers from the United States, earning it the moniker of the Kmart of the illegal slave trade, as described by Dr. Gerald Horne. During this time, the United States strategically targeted Lisbon, perceived as one of the weaker major colonial powers, to establish control over the illegal slave trade, with London primarily focused on monitoring slave trade in West Africa. East Africa became an open route for illicit activities. By the 1830s, the United States had established a practical monopoly in the region and fiercely guarded its position. An elongated triangular trade network emerged, connecting East Africa with Brazil and the United States, particularly Salem, Massachusetts. Salem became synonymous with slave trade to the extent that Africans associated the United States with Salem. American nationals would purchase vessels and rent them to Brazilian and Portuguese slave traders in Brazil. These ships, protected by the American flag and manned by American crews, were used for round-trip voyages to Africa. Shipbuilders in eastern ports, including Beverly and Salem, constructed vessels specifically for this Brazil-Africa trade. Zanzibar had a notorious reputation as a major site for the African slave trade. Records indicate that between September 1832 and May 1834, out of 41 vessels arriving in Zanzibar, 32 were American, while the rest were from England, France, and Spain. This trade flourished rapidly, as observed by a Salem merchant writing from Rio de Janeiro, noting the increasing number of vessels departing daily for the African coast to procure slaves. The Ottoman Empire was a major participant in the illegal slave trade and trafficked enslaved Africans to Asia and the Americas. The territory of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century included the Nile Valley. One of the major purchasers of these Africans were the Portuguese, who smuggled them to Brazil. The hemispheric context of the Confederacy has fortunately received increasing attention by historians in recent years. The rebellion by the slaveholding region of the United States did not occur in isolation, but occurred in the context of a global struggle over slavery. While Britain worked to end the slave trade and slavery worldwide, nations such as Brazil, Spain, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire benefited from the industry and hoped to maintain slavery, if not the trade itself. Gerald Horne, in The Deepest South, examined the critical importance of Brazil in the minds of Southern politicians as a potential ally and eventual refuge after the end of the American Civil War. Horne argues for a larger role in the historiography for slaveholding Brazil, as well as other parts of the Lusophone world, in our understanding of the context for the Confederacy. Along with Cuba, Brazil was a slave state, but with its immense size and political independence, it held an outsized role in the mentality of Southern politicians before and during the American Civil War. Brazil continued to hold a special place in the minds of slave-owning Southerners as a refuge for some intransigents after the war's end. The ongoing, albeit illegal, slave trade coming from Portuguese colonies in Africa and the Ottoman Empire was an additional complicating factor in the history of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. Global British efforts to put a complete end to the slave trade, as well as to slavery itself, consumed a surprising amount of British resources, from Royal Navy contingents patrolling the west coast of Africa to diplomats pressuring foreign governments to adopt significant legislation against the entire industry. Confederate representatives might have used the good offices of Spain to gain recognition from Portugal as well. Portugal was even smaller than Spain, of course, and of less international significance and military potential. Despite this weak position, it was a nation that boasted not only an African empire in Angola, Mozambique, and elsewhere, but an outsized role in the illegal slave trade that continued to the Americas throughout the 19th century. Despite British naval and diplomatic efforts to destroy this commerce in human cargo, some of the slaves transported by the Portuguese came surreptitiously to Brazil or Cuba, while others were purchased within the Ottoman Empire. A traditional ally of Britain, Portugal nonetheless resisted entreaties from London to put a stop to this practice among its merchantmen and shipping companies. Like Belgium, another small nation with outsized territory in Africa, Portugal nonetheless could have played a role in a coalition of states, which might have also included Brazil, to buttress the Confederacy. These states, of course, relied upon the toleration of the British Empire, the only power with an effective veto over major operations by these minor countries. Ancient Kemet holds profound importance in understanding the intricacies of the slave trade due to its rich history and pivotal role in African civilization. Scholars like Dr. Kwame Nantambu extend the origins of the transatlantic slave trade to Kemet's ancient resistance to Eurasian invasions, broadening our historical perspective. The migrations of ancient Kemets to West and Central Africa, documented by researchers such as Dr. Musa Alam and Yoro Diao, reveal patterns of movement driven by external pressures and oppressive regimes, reshaping the continent's demographic landscape. Moreover, the intersection of Kemet with the Maafa underscores the enduring influence of colonization, exploitation, and displacement on African peoples across continents. By recognizing Kemet as the cradle of African civilizations and understanding its connections to the slave trade, we gain deeper insights into the roots of contemporary social and political dynamics within the African diaspora and beyond.